So, good evening, everybody. My name is Denis Stolyarov. I'm an assistant curator at Pushkin House. Thank you for joining us for our next event, exploring the books shortlisted for the Pushkin House Book Prize. The winner will be announced on the 15th of June. Today we are talking about the geography and queer history of St. Petersburg. And we have Dr. Olga Petri with us, the author of this book. Olga is an urban historian, historical geographer, and a research fellow in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. After finishing this book, she's now working, she's undertaking postdoctoral research and working on the project entitled Beastly St. Petersburg, Humans and Other Animals in Imperial Russia. I hope we'll have a chance to discuss it here as well. And with Olga, we have Olga Doletskaya, a current PhD student at UCL at School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. And Olga's research is exploring queer parenthood in Russia at the moment. So please join me in welcoming both Olgas.
Thank you, Denise. This is a double Olga evening, and happy first day of Pride. This is very fitting. So to start, I just wanted to say thank you for the book. It was a great read. Well, I mean, every time I feel like doing queer research, every time I say like, this was so great, this was amazing, this is such an interesting fact, it's usually about like queer tragedy and like something about homophobia and like policing. And I have to like, for people outside of the field, I have to always be like, oh yeah, it's very tragic, but it's such a cool story. It's so good for my research. Anyway, thank you so much. And maybe to start with, could you tell us a little bit about the title of the book, the full title, where it comes from, and maybe a little bit about the main kind of argument, what the book is about?
Thank you very much for coming. It's an honor to be here. I've never been here before, and it's absolutely beautiful place. And thank you for joining us today for this conversation. Thank you, Olga, for coming, and Denise for organizing everything. It's an honor. Yeah. The title changed so many times, I have to admit. It started with a city of familiar strangers, and then somehow transformed to places of tenderness and heat. And in this transition, I think the most important thing was this staying close to the city spaces. And I thought the places of tenderness and heat actually reflects that more than probably city of familiar strangers. Why? Quite simply because this book, as I write in conclusion, is actually more about the city than about identities and homosexual man itself. Because if you look at the book, if you read it, you will see that actually in terms of empirical stuff, I'm relying more on sanitary reports, on police archives, rather than actually autobiographical information about queer men. So Places of Tenderness and Heat kind of reflects a very now traditional historiography of the city, of the history of the city. We know from Marshall Berman, who kind of described the city as a city of contrast, you know, with big facades, beautiful buildings, but actually a rather difficult situation inside of this building, so it refers to this kind of set of contrasts. But what I'm doing in this book is to suggest that actually that contrast, you know, it's not that straightforward, and there are blurring boundaries there in place. So Places of Tenderness refers to places of queer socialization, love, friendship, just hanging out together, just being together in that city, in this beautiful city. For those of you who were there, you will remember that it's extremely beautiful city. I'm biased, I was born there. But also, it's a place of this tenderness, and the place where the sky, as Kuzmin said, proves some kind of love. So, and Places of Heat refers to a more direct sexual desires that might be, for example, expressed in semi-public spaces like commercial bathhouses. In a more direct meaning, actually, I took this title from Kuzmin's diary, who in June 1906, he was discussing this planned to create a map, and I'm a geographer, I like maps, as you can imagine. So I created a map and a poetry that will be going together with this map about the city and about their city, where they kind of go between Znamenskaya bathhouse that was located next to Tavritsky Garden, a place of tenderness. So place's tenderness is Tavritsky Garden, and place of heat is this Znamenskaya bathhouse. So there is a lot of meaning here, and I thought the title reflects this, a very geographical reading of a queer milieu. And what I'm actually doing with this title in this book is to suggest that we should, to uncover the queer histories, we have to sometimes go beyond probably looking for queer identities in the cities. It's a very important topic and it has been covered. So I thought, as a geographer, I need to understand how actually the city manages the queer lives. And I was talking about negotiation of urban spaces. You know, how, for example, urban authorities, you know, sanitary commission practitioners, doctors, they all, sometimes passerby or hooligans, they all negotiate that particular queer milieu in that space. And probably that's the main argument, that through this negotiation we can uncover something what was hidden in the city.
Thank you. I really love because as an anthropologist, we focus so much on people's stories that it's hard for me to imagine how to do kind of more historical research when we can't ask someone directly, kind of what do you think, how was your experience, kind of how did you feel about this? And I think a lot of queer history is imagining being in one's kind of shoes, trying to imagine what for example, Koizin felt when he was imprisoned for sodomy in the Soviet Union. And that is always kind of lacking for me a little bit. And the way that you do this, kind of let's imagine how the city shapes queer experiences, and kind of let's look at how these spaces are created, and then maybe we can imagine what people did in them and who those people were. That I thought was really interesting and a really novel approach. I guess the next kind of thing to talk about is what is a milieu, and I can't pronounce it.
Neither I, it's fine.
There was a lot of French in the book, which I just like, well, kind of like a few French phrases, which I was like, I wish.
Fin-de-Siècle.
I wish I remembered. But yeah, so what is it? How do you understand it? How do you interpret it?
It's actually a big question, and I have been thinking a lot about the last couple of days, actually, because I imagine you would ask me that, and I'm asked this question quite a lot, and over the last couple of years, I think I developed the way I respond to this question, which is not actually satisfactory. I wasn't never satisfied with the way I respond to that. And I've been thinking about for the last couple of days how to respond, and you know, for me, I think in my mind, there are two answers to this. On the one hand, we have the queer milieu as a kind of network of patterns and movements in the city. It's the constellation of individuals that sometimes coming in, coming out, they not really call themselves or define themselves what we might call right now homosexuals or men who have sex with men. They are just part of this milieu. They have fun there. They sometimes harass for being in this milieu, but it's a kind of they're in and out, right? So that's the kind of a very straightforward maybe answer of this. It's a kind of network of loosely connected individuals who find themselves in between places of tenderness and heat, right? It's one answer for this question. It's a more geographical probably answer would be to say that milieu originally, it's a French term, as you rightly pointed out, it's kind of referring to middle or place. And it will, of course, it's a geographical location in the city. Where do I find the boundaries of this place? I can't really say, actually. You know, it's loosely connected of patterns, movement, locations. So it is in the middle. But also we have to, I'm thinking here about, you know, queer phenomenology and Sarah Ahmed, who suggests that queer itself is a kind of geographical, a spatial term. And she talks about how being queer is somehow not follow the direct straight lines. And in that sense, you know, being in a queer milieu, meaning that you don't cross the street just straight away, but actually you go around somehow and find your people with whom you find each other yourself, like you find yourself through the connection with these spaces and with these people. I think I made it better answer this time. So thank
Yeah,
you.
I like the double
Yes, yeah.
double meaning of it. So, what exactly what are the practices or the interactions that happen in the queer milieu in the at the turn of the century in St. Petersburg? What are some of your favorite stories maybe from it? What is happening there?
So in the book, I talk about specific things. I talk about bathing in the city. It's important. I talk about cruising. I talk about street life. And here I actually differentiate between street life and cruising. And I do it on purpose because I think sometimes it's very difficult to understand what is cruising in a historical city, because back then the term cruising, it's not the same as right now. So we can't really, I mean, it's also methodological and etymological question actually, which we might discuss later. You know, how would I apply this? Like, what was it actually cruising? Can we define it as a cruising? So I define between that just being in the city, in street life, and cruising, and just being in that city more broadly. So regarding favorite stories, I think I start this book with the story of Johann and Dmitri, who we might define cruise along Kanavagardeyski Boulevard in the city. And it's a good example because on the one hand, from the archival materials, we can't really say whether or not they were queer in a modern sense. But on the other hand, the way the story unfolds from this archival, very short kind of, handwritten police report, we see that the interaction, specifically the place where they met, what they were doing in that particular place, was definitely cruising and actually a breakup between them. So, and you can kind of uncover this slowly. So that's the one story which I really like in the book. Another story that is contrast to that actually is the story. That's surprisingly, it's the only story that I directly refer to private spaces in the city, because the book is about public and semi-public spaces, where I talk about the Sacred Directive that was issued in 1910, that, basically the city police asked all constables in all city boroughs to collect the information about all homosexuals living in the city, and, the list of homosexuals who kind of invite and organize parties. And it is also remarkably spatial story, because you can trace how actually from different boroughs response varied, and how constables made decisions on the spot, who included, who not included in this story. So it's another story of policing, of course, that is not just straightforward in regulation of that behavior, but actually finding leeways, finding the ways to persecute homosexual behavior in which we don't expect even. And it relates to the question of bathing here again, because commercial bathhouses, about which I talk in the book, it was obviously, as Dan Healy writes, it's the place where homosexual men historically met. It was very diverse group of people visiting this space. But I was trying to actually understand what's happening in these spaces and who, going there and how that space was constructed. And I think I'm blubbering right now, but the practice of bathing then also reveals that the persecution of homosexual behavior comes in other ways, not just direct application of the Article 1995, right?
I really want to talk about this, and also in general, kind of this relationship between kind of the queer milieu, has, in itself, there are all of these queer men. They have kind of a community or a network. They hang out together. They don't just kind of have sex or cruise to have sex. There's this community element, but there are also these kind of, the police are involved, the blackmailers are involved, the hooligans, all of these other kind of actors, and sometimes bad faith actors that are existing in this same space, and they're all interacting with each other, which is I thought was really interesting, and kind of how the police, so I wanted to talk about policing and surveillance and these creative ways or kind of interesting ways in which police try to control queer and homosexual behavior, which, and maybe I'm wrong here, kind of made me think that they weren't as kind of black and white against homosexual behavior as we might imagine now, looking back on the past.
Yeah, I mean, the chapter about policing was one of the hardest chapters to write in terms of understanding the empirical materials, finding the sources, and actually trying to understand what's happening. Because for those of you who don't know, in Russia, homosexuality was criminalized, and it was only criminalized on a specific act. It's Article 95, refers to actually act between two individuals, annual act, so not specifically actually a man. So we have the persecution of a specific acts, not behavior, right? And in contrast, for example, what's happening here in the UK, we don't have any legislation that targeted, for homosexual cruising, for example, or any type of queer behavior. So that's kind of the information that I had when I started this project, right? And then scholarly discussions suggested that actually, but just by looking at criminal statistic, you see that we don't have a lot of cases of persecution in Imperial Russia, and that's absolutely true, and I'm not questioning that. That's indeed, there was no enough cases. But I was born in Russia to know that sometimes the law and how it's actually, the police is happening in Russia, it can be very varied, and actually I wanted to see actually what does it mean, lack of cases, what does it actually tells us? And my working hypothesis was that probably situation was much more complicated. Very stupid hypothesis, probably to start with, but I was trying to then see, okay, we're looking at spaces, we're looking at the way in which constables on the beat would probably react to what we might call now queer behavior or queer identities. So, and then I was looking at many different stenographs and reports. People were arrested on, for example, Nevsky Prospect, every night, many people for soliciting for improper behavior, just for loitering. It was almost nothing for me. Just I was thinking, oh, it's going nowhere. And these files, we don't have enough files, but it's still quite a lot of information. Some of them why I was open for the first time. It's look at, okay, this is the men and women just arrested daily, nightly, many of them. And I knew this space because I knew from the previous research that that's the where cruising sites at night. And I couldn't find anything, basically. And then one day, it's like the golden archival files, I discovered the case of Ludwig Simmel, who also, was a habitué of Nevsky Prospect. He was arrested at 2 o'clock in the morning, as many others. But the difference in his case was that to his case, there was attached this anonymous letter, denunciation letter, that was about how homosexuality, or specifically sodomy, as it was referred in the letter, was taking over the city, and how the public cannot fight by itself, and how it's outrageous, and secret police should act immediately. And remarkably, the secret police acted immediately the day or 2 days after he was arrested and actually banned from residing in the city for 3 years. So that was pretty extreme case, right? So, and also that letter contains information that there is specifically one man who is just absolutely appalling. He wears the brown coat, and you have to basically target him. Then they arrested Ludwig Simmel. There was nothing specifically Polish about him. He was described as a Polish gentleman. Nothing about Polish, nothing about broad coat, nothing. It's just they probably arrested, I suggest in the book, because of the fact that he was in this space. So I started looking kind of inside, and this what the file suggests is not like it's just one file. So we have to keep that in mind. So empirically, it's probably not representative of all situations, but what it gives us is kind of the glance to understand that sometimes, at least, constables were using, for example, petty crime strategies to arrest people on the street that might have looked for them as queer, for example. So they found a way to control the moral order of the city in the way we previously didn't imagine. Right, so, but apart from that, that policing extends to, for example, the way in which the bathhouses were kind of modernized in the city. And specifically, deviant behavior, as we might call it, was targeted as a part of the, these movements, hygiene, modernity movements, right? So that's also a form of policing. So you see through this different regulation of public and city public space, we see, another example, of course, the renovation of Passage. That's a really telling story about the way they get rid of the whole gallery just because it was associated with homosexual behavior, apparently. So the city authorities of various kinds, not just directly police, were concerned about this clearly and, you know, tried to manage the public order in the way they could. So to say that, you know, just because there was not enough cases of directly homosexual persecution, there was kind of tolerance in the city, I would probably not agree with that statement. I think it was risky, it was difficult for this man to find the path in the city and to kind of navigate that city, right?
I love that there was a moral panic letter that was saying in, what year was it? 1900. In the really early 1900s, that was like the homosexuals are taking over the city. We need to do something immediately. And now, 100 plus years
and we shouldn't
later,
smile at this point, to be honest. But yeah,
well, yeah, but now this is exactly what's happening now. And
of course, the parallels.
Yeah, that now it's like, oh, the transgenders are taking over the city. We need to do something immediately, even though we can very clearly see.
Yeah, history repeats itself.
Yeah, but this is really interesting, and also really interesting in kind of when we look at police reports, oftentimes with any kind of legislation against homosexual behavior or homosexuality. We like rarely see a lot of cases actually in the UK. The law against sodomy wasn't really used a lot. But then how do we see if queer behavior was actually, can we say then, or then being queer was accepted?
Yeah, yeah. You know, even Kuzmin was persecuted.
Yeah.
For 2 years later, but his novel was persecuted and he was sent to court for publishing pornography. The novel Wings, originally historians thought that it wasn't the case. He was not persecuted, but he was 2 years later, and that's why probably it kind of disappeared from attention. But even that, it was not directly for being homosexual. It was not for being queer, as the Oscar Wilde case, probably, but, he had to pay a fine, and friends collected money and paid the fine, apparently. But it was a big fine for him, and he got really worried. Actually, it's really interesting how he writes about this in his diary. You can't really understand what it is about. And then I found this newspaper clip about, how Kuzmin, pornographer, published this novel 2 years later after publication. But yeah, it's an interesting case. Another example of how it's actually happening in the city, for example.
I was wondering about cruising, and this is just a kind of, because I know that in the Soviet Union, cruising spots were called pleshki. And cruising in the UK refers, they often use the word cottaging, or kind of, there was like various vocabulary. Was there any particular vocabulary that you found in your sources? Were they really kind of not saying what they were actually doing and you had to kind of uncover it, or were they was there a code that they were using in regards to like cruising behaviors or like spots for cruising around the city?
There was no such a term like pleshki, for example. I mean, I think I should be careful here. I don't want to say there was no, because future historians might uncover things that I didn't uncover. I didn't come across any specific terms for, a part of Tavrida. Kuzmin refers to Znamenskaya bathhouse as bathhouse. Sometimes he refers the French term, Poudechon. Sorry for my French. That's right, the places of heat. So basically, that's how he calls bathhouses in his diary. Interestingly, here, for example, when he talks about queer people or individuals that are kind of part of his gang, as he calls it, he talks about gramotny, a specific term, and I think it's very close to what we now understand as a queer. And I touched upon a bit about this terminological complexity, that term gramotny, illiterate, is actually is what the closest what we can get when we think about queer. But he doesn't directly speak about give a sort of gramotny. Oh, another good example is how he talks about actual sexual acts. He's very discreet, but he talks about dying. So every time something like this, it's kind of dying, which is kind of interesting. metaphor, but it's also very French as far as I know. That's how it's calls in French.
I was gonna say
and he was, his mom was French, so it's kind of comes. That's why I think but in terms of locations, I don't, as I said, I didn't come across any specific locations. But I think you're asking me a question that, to some extent, is not directly for my research. You see, my only autobiographical bit is Kuzmin's story, and it's one chapter in the book, right? What I was looking at is actually management of the public and semi-public spaces, and I looked at specific, archival sources of, sanitary reports, police, for example, even a credit society, to understand the Passage story. So these sources, of course, would not directly even call sodomy. They just kind of, deal with the space, right? Kuzmin, yes, he will come up with specific terms, but, this is such a kind of, not a small part of the book, but it's one chapter in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought the word literate was really kind of...
Oh, I really like it, yeah.
Yeah, and there was a quote, was that a quote from Kuzmin where he says, like, I found this, I kind of picked up this guy and he was literate.
Yeah, he was driving on a cab, I think, on Nevsky Prospect, and he immediately showed himself, like, as a literate, it's great.
Which kind of almost there's like a class aspect to it, so like, what is it to be illiterate? Someone who is illiterate is kind of a lower class, potentially, person, so being literate is... Don't know. Yeah,
but actually, that particular person who was literate on a cab, he was, as we later discovered, he was footman at a restaurant. So we might think that he was probably not. He was probably literate, but in a way, he was coming from a. I don't want to use this word, but low class society. But you see what I mean, right? So. But it's interesting. It's different use of, I think, of literate, meaning that if you're literate, you can understand the complexity of that milieu, if you see what I mean. So if you're literate, you can't kind of understand it. And I think, to some extent, actually, his novel, Kuzmin, The Wings, is all about transforming from being illiterate to literate. And it's quite interesting how the discovery of himself, Vanya, it's actually telling story of the discovery, right? So it's beyond class understanding. Yeah. If I was really quick.
I'm tempted to start using it now.
And
sure.
Talk about I use it for myself,
But as you said, it is a small part of the book, and the main part of the book is the city and the urban space, and how it's kind of how the queer milieu shapes the urban space, and the opposite, how the urban space shapes the way that kind of queer experiences happen. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Maybe like some more kind of, I'm thinking about the electricity stories, and kind of how the city changed as a response to queer behavior, and vice versa.
Thank you very much actually for saying that, because I think it's a kind of very straightforward thinking that, individuals arrive to the city and their sexuality transforms. And we're talking not just about homosexuality, but any type of sexuality. You come to the city, you become a different person. You become an urban resident, right? And you get in this new identity, right? And in history of sexuality scholarship, we learn that you come to the city, you discover your homosexuality, and the city makes you, for example, homosexual. For example, But what I'm trying to suggest in this book is exactly what you said, that actually the city changes so much because of the presence of this milieu, right? And, a couple of examples, you mentioned street light. I think, we are talking about a very interesting kind of tension here. When you cruise, you need to be visible, right? You need to find somebody who you would like, probably, right? So you need to have some light. But it shouldn't be too bright so that the police constable on the beat, and in St. Petersburg, on Nevsky Prospect, every corner there was a constable on the beat standing, городовой, right? So you have to make sure you're visible, but not too visible. All right, so, and if we look at actually how the street, like how Nevsky Prospect and the streets next to that particular big street was illuminated, they overlap with the main cruising patterns. Kind of Gvardeyski Boulevard, the same. That's kind of, or Fontanka embankment. That's the places where then queer men would go, that they provide them some light, and also you need to remember that St. Petersburg, it's on the north, it's dark there, you know, I grew up there, so it's 11 o'clock in the morning, it's still dark. So it is dark there, so you need some light. So that's really important to actually, you know, when you, almost like different maps of the city, so it's a map of lighting and then you cruising map, you attach them as like, oh, that's interesting that they overlap, right? Also then you look at this kind of public services like public urinals, and you again see, you know, this, in the book, it's one of my favorite pictures of the urinal next to Anichkov Bridge. Oh, I love that picture, right? It's probably taken in the morning, so it's very empty and kind of peaceful there. And you can imagine, so, I mean, not in urinal festival, but you see what I mean. So, and then you can see that apart from this urinal, there was also a public toilet next to the circus and Mikhailovska Square there. So it's kind of, you see these patterns of movements between this, and that's what's actually happening, that they would come to, because this urinal on the picture, it's impossible to probably do any acts there. So you kind of look, absorb, and then you go to different toilet where you actually, it's a bit warmer, because also St. Petersburg is super cold, right? So you have to keep that in mind, this kind of climate of the city. So you go to different, and then, as I said, it's very interesting geographical work when you just kind of take these different layers of the city and you touch, and that's where the map of the milieu comes. Then, of course, the story of Passage, how it was renovated, and how this you know, journalist was writing about the transformation of Passage, how everything is gone now, and it's beautiful young ladies are walking through this space. Yeah, so.
That photo is incredible, because every time, because obviously like kind of male urinals or kind of public bathrooms are a very well-known kind of historically across the board place for kind of queer men to cruise or kind of have sex or have some sort of sexual interactions or meet each other. And I always imagined that as like a kind of a big public bathroom, like a bunch of stalls or a bunch of urinals together. And then seeing that tiny little like thing and imagining that being like a, and all of these different layers of, you know, if it's so small, then it's really cold, but then also it's not policed as much. So then maybe you can kind of meet someone and then move on somewhere else.
And you move to bathhouses. You know, the dossier I mentioned in the book, they specifically describe this pattern of movements that, you know, you look and then you go to a warmer place, either to bathhouses or to a different toilet close by, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just kind of, you start filling in the gaps of all of these different little spots in the city that you almost don't see, and then you start seeing how all of these kind of spots form a map together of how people travel around. And about Passage, so how did it become this really big queer spot, or kind of do we know why? What kind of, what prerequisites made it such a good spot for queer people to hang out in? Or actually, what was it? Kind of what's the history of Passage? Because,
So I will answer you this question as a geographer, but not a climatologist. It's very cold, and it was the only kind of closed space, and you can walk in the city. And for example, in winter, it's roofed, it's glass, and it's lighted. So as I said, it's important to be, you know, it was warm. It's also, there was many coffee shops. And for cruising, it's very important, this concept of significant glaze, so you can actually see who's looking at you and you're looking. And you can, you know, if it's shops, you can stop and look as if you're looking at something, but actually as a place to initiate the first discussion about something on a display, for example. So I think that role of Passage was very significant in that regard. So because you can go there, it's relatively warm, it's warmer than outside, or at least it's not snowing or it's not raining. So it's kind of, it's nicer in that regard, right? And also you have this opportunity just to stroll, and as if you're picking something in a shop, but actually initiate a discussion. So there was also a couple of the coffee shops there, so where you can sit and have a coffee with a friend, for example. And from the police archive, like from the police archives, secret police, there were always, and there was a specific coffee shop there in the Passage, and the secret police agent was always there. I just, it was very bizarre. I was reading this file. It was like he was always there observing something. I couldn't find any specific, and that's why it's not really a part of the book, because I couldn't find any specific kind of indication that was he really looking for queer man or something like that. But there was a secret police undercover all the time in that coffee shop. Also tells you something about that particular place, right? So you can sit and you can actually, have a conversation. Also, there were rooms per hour upstairs. That also, of course, functions as a sort of place to go and have sex. There was also a very convenient gallery, and it was described in the dossier I mentioned already that, men could go in the gallery and just look downstairs and observe men downstairs, like picking a potential partner, for example.
Window shopping.
Yes, something like that, but like also on the gallery. And the gallery was specifically targeted in the renovation because the gallery was associated with homosexual behavior specifically, and it was closed, so they closed that. And so I suppose the geography and of that space really made it very convenient for the queer encounters in the city.
And it was kind of an open secret of kind of everyone was aware that there was something queer going on. There were queer men.
According to dossier, it kind of was an open secret, yeah. And since we look at the newspapers clippings, it seems like everyone knew what's going on there. So, and then they closed it and renovated. And it was also in terms of, it was a very long process in terms of actually do this renovation and initiate it, and because the city government is actually invested by private individuals, so to find money for this renovation, it was important, and government wanted to change that space, so it took them a while, yeah.
Which also makes me think about the present and a kind of narrative, a homophobic narrative that we often hear is, Russia never had queer people, or kind of this erasure of queer history. And when we think about queer history, I think a really easy image to imagine is someone who was really closeted and had like queer sex or had like a queer partner, but no one else knew about it. But actually everyone knew, and then we've kind of erased that part of, there was a whole massive shopping mall basically in the middle of St. Petersburg that everyone knew queer things happened there. Obviously, we can't really put the same identity of people knew there were gay people because the term gay and that the gay identity didn't exist, but it was definitely more, yeah, you know what I mean? Like it's really, it's just really, I would like some homophobes to read this.
Yeah. I think we should be quite careful when we think about identities and application. That's why my focus is on space, not identities in the book, because it's very difficult to actually understand the identity formation itself. It's a work of not a geographer, and I thought I wouldn't be a good person to do that actually. And so identity is the way we understand it now and the way it was before. Obviously, it's very different. And I think the queer milieu, again, returning to this term, is a good thing because men, if they identify them as a man, all right, participated in this milieu. They also have their social lives. They also have their professional lives. And, just to treat them as a queer man will be just a mistake because, you have different identities and they overlap, right? And, and just to kind of attached. In that way, I'm a bit follow Michel Foucault, who didn't like to have an identity. He was resistant to having a specific identity. He was like, I'm just myself. Because as soon as you take the identity, you kind of, almost lock yourself in a box. So, and I think in that regard also queer men in St. Petersburg, they have different types of identities, professional, social, family identities, and they overlap. And, the same as spaces, right? So it was not just a cruising, it was also just Nevsky Prospect and hooligans, passerbyers, women, constables. Everyone went in space and they interacted. And just to look at the city as a queer space would be actually, that's why I'm using queer milieu. I'm trying to kind of to suggest that it's not just about queer socialization in the city. It overlaps with what's happening in the city and how it happens. So I'm interested in what they were doing in a way. And whether or not they identify themselves as a queer, no, I'm not particularly interested in that. I think, as I said, I think I will be just one person to do that type of research, right?
You mentioned kind of queer men and whether they were actually men. And I was really interested reading the book. There was a few moments particularly about totki, about these kind of slightly older queer men that would sometimes bisex or be kind of like sugar daddies of younger patrons, and kind of their relationship with men, and also dames, dame, that would dress up, or kind of these conversations about wearing makeup, conversations about dressing up in women's clothing, or kind of these like gender transgressions, make me wonder about a trans or an intersectional reading, and whether that could kind of be an interesting avenue in this research. And obviously also you're not focusing as much on particular individuals and kind of digging really deep into who they are. You don't have that information, but kind of saying that they are queer men. Are they?
Yeah. As I said, my focus on space and negotiation on management. I don't like this word, but it's a management of public and semi-public spaces. And I was thinking about this transgender reading of my book, and thinking about, for example, use of the makeup. Kuzmin was using makeup, as well as many of his friends, and they were talking about where to put mushki on the cheeks. So they were kind of experimenting with different types of self-expression through makeup, I would put it that way. And of course it is, you might now think it's very feminine, but looking historically at this, was it really that feminine in a way? A lot of men actually, it was not, all the time when I think about these categories right now, I struggle, because I think, can we actually directly apply the old thing to early 20th century St. Petersburg in the way? So Kuzmin was really advocating for black eyeliners. He really liked it, and you see his portraits, right? So, but I know that it's not just queer man was using that, clearly from his diary, so it was not just for queer men, right? So they were using, of course, the different, styling of the way they were. For example, Kuzmin loved the yellow T-shirts. He was really big fan, and of course, this reference to yellow daffodil in a T-shirt or shirt, it's a kind of symbol of the queerness. So, can we talk about this binaries, transgender, gender binaries more broadly? I think I'm not, actually, now I'm answering this question, I'm not really answering, I see it, but yes, it's very difficult, because first of all, we have to think about identities much more deeper than I thought in my book, obviously. We have to think, and it's a kind of form of a self-criticism, about masculinity more broadly, which again, I'm not actually exploring in my book, again, because this is kind of outside the scope of the discussion. But you're absolutely right to question the way they perceive themselves in a way in that particular urban environment, right? And maybe there will be somebody, reflecting on my book and thinking about this, and they will come up with some sort of way to do this reading, if you see what I mean, all right? So, yeah, sorry if it was probably, when you think too much about something, then the answer is usually not really good.
No, I think there's definitely a lot of room to talk about gender transgression and what it means to be a man, or what it means to be masculine back then and now. And I think I was just also thinking about a few examples when you mentioned either wearing women's clothing or in that way, and maybe kind of the intersection of sex work and kind of cross-dressing, which also could be a part of the work, or it could be more of they felt like a woman, so that's why they were
see, from dossier and from other sources, we know that, of course, for example, it's very interesting, for example, in relation to aunties, sometimes they say they were dressed as a female more, but actually we have an example of Tchaikovsky, so it's very kind of, it's I would say it's a really interesting question that needs to be discussed and actually explored by a historian or cultural geographer, of course. But you see, because I think even in relation to, for example, cross-dressing, can we actually talk about transgender immediately if we just put a dress? I don't think it would be right to do that. So I think it goes much deeper, because of course dressing up for a ball, and they did it a lot, of course, playing the roles of a woman and a man, that happened, that kind of playing around. Can we immediately connect that play with actual identity formation? That's the big question. And I think to have materials, and like archival materials, to do this step, it will be very interesting. But I'm not doing this. I'm sorry. But it's amazing avenue to discover. Absolutely. It's just the question that, I think everyone who will do this type of research, they have to stay really clear to the ground in a way that, just putting the female clothing, as I said, will not make you a transgender. Does this make sense? It's much more complicated than, So.
100%. And kind of, it's very difficult for us to, because if the trans identity hasn't really kind of taken shape, then, or for the next 30, 40 years, or we could argue even later than that. So it's very hard to kind of find. It's very easy when you find someone saying, "I've always felt like a woman," but then
I also come up with the answer. So, I think especially about intersex here, because the type of the materials I looked, I was kind of going away from medical forensic discussions. And it was my purpose, because this type of research has been already done, and I felt like I don't want to invent the wheel. And medical, like Tarnowski, Mierzewski, they all talk about, actually, if you read them, it's very about physiology and stuff like that. So I think you can find a lot of stuff from medical forensic discussions about that, actually, rather than to actually the management of a public and semi-public spaces.
Yeah,
Does it make
I
sense?
think you're actually, now I'm thinking about, I can imagine a book about medical forensics being written.
More about transgender,
yeah.
like a transgender reading of medical forensic discussions, because I haven't done it because my purpose was actually to go away from medical forensic discussion and the construction of discourses of homosexuality. All right, so that was not my intention. Now I'm more happy with my answer, to some extent.
No, I think all of the three answers were very good. I liked all of them. You mentioned archives and kind of potential research in this area, and I can't help but wonder, will this ever be, or not ever, but how possible is it to do any type of work that you've done now? Is it possible, this type of work?
You mean in Russia? Or where?
Yes, in Russia. And kind of how did you do this archival work? How did you queer the archive? And can we maybe speculate about what's next for archival work in Russia, for queer researchers or for researchers studying gender or other topics that are now seem to be more and more dangerous? And what else can we do?
It is an important question. First, I would say how I did this and my thoughts about how we can look for some paths for the future. So when I was thinking about my first archival trip, my thinking about the project, sorry for taking time to think. You had to write a topic when you apply to work in Russian archives, and I was working in the municipal archives of St. Petersburg, at the Городской архив, city archive, right? So it's a small place on Pushkinskaya in St. Petersburg, Kolomna, and you need to go to the director of this art institution, and you have to write the topic of your research. It's an interesting discussion that with the director of that institution, because usually it happened to me at least 3 times. That person will tell me actually how to frame my research. They will actually tell me the topic, which is quite interesting already. So I discussed it with my supervisor, and we were thinking about how to frame this to make it broader, because I knew that the broader I make it, there will be easier for me to order different things. So that was my first kind of assumption that will help me if I do it broader topic. Then And originally I thought I will come to the archives and I will name it like homosexual life on the streets of St. Petersburg. I think that was my kind of the topic, the отношения that I wrote for the archive, Pskovskaya. And then I came to the Pskovskaya. I mean, I corresponded before, so they were waiting for me, and I came. And I think the director of you go to her, so she signed the documents. Everything was, they're extremely helpful in these institutions. But she asked me, like, what are you actually doing? I remember that question, like, what are you actually doing? And it's not specific enough. And I was puzzled. And then I said, I will explore deviant behavior in public and semi-public spaces. And that was the topic that kind of stayed with me, because of course I made numerous visits to this archival institution, and actually I used the same topic I think at other archival institutions without kind of really make it, and nobody, after that actually people kind of stopped asking me. It was probably specific enough, I guess, so it was kind of deviant behavior was okay. No, she asked me, deviant behavior, you mean prostitution? And I said, yes. And they're like, yes. You know, it was back in 2014, so it was already, you know, time I was worried, not without reasons. I will explain why. So it was my first archival trips, and then I made a trip to Moscow, and that's when I was there for a couple of weeks already. Everything was okay. I struggled in Moscow. That was difficult because I couldn't find anything. It was, you know, being far away. I felt very disconnected, and it was a difficult archival trip for me more broadly. And then I was sitting there reading Kony's private archives, thinking, okay, I will look at his private archives, see what comes. And then the Secret Service person came to me and sat next to me and said, actually, what are you doing? That was an uncanny situation. Like, what are you actually exploring? Like, what is your topic? And you look in the specific files, and we looked at the files you ordered, like, what are you actually doing? And
that's very scary.
That was unpleasant conversation, I will put it that way. But I think I was always very, you know, as I said, I kind of, it helped me. I know it will probably sound, I don't want to sound arrogant, but it helped me to grow up in Russia. So I'm kind of, you know, I think now that I had kind of intuitive understanding on how I should speak to the authorities in a way, and I was polite. I was very kind of careful. I was speaking every word, and it went all right in a way. He left me, and I continued my research. But he wasn't that reading room every day, and I knew that he's there. And of course, reflecting on that now is like probably, you know, it wasn't more unpleasant than I thought, but you know, that's kind of, I thought, you know, people the history of whom I'm trying to write, they were much more, you know, I'm in a privileged position actually, so I was kind of thinking like, just ignore it, your fears, it's fine, you're doing great job, like, it's important what you're doing. So that helped me. So uncovering these files was this kind of very strange process. Sorry for this very long answer for the first part of the question, but the second part of the question about the future. I think, the way I framed my research, deviant behavior, it's broad enough. But then there are the files I ordered, and I think that's how my book, I hope, might be useful for other historians of queerness in other cities that do not have a lot of autobiographical information. It's helpful because if we look at the Sanitary Commission reports, at the policing more broadly, at the street life, on reconstruction of Passage, then you know you can really get the way in which the queer milieu was developing in the city was perceived by the member of the public, and you know actually you can understand the city without maybe directly engaging with the autobiographical information. So it's a way to explore queer sexuality, queer history, without having a diary. It's great to have a diary, it's the best, but if you don't, like, then the city, that queer history of that city will disappear? Hopefully not. So if you tried to go around this and say, you know, actually I would look at the, you know, the management of the space, then I uncover at least some aspects of an urban environment that is hidden, right? Even without having these autobiographical sources, right?
And kind of that's exactly what I was kind of the conversation that I was imagining about how, kind of going around these bigger cases and going into kind of lower level administrative archives. And you mentioned, I think, in the book that the archives were quite damaged from the kind of the
fire, quite simple. Some of them were just burned, physically burned. Some of the files were, had this amazing picture. It's because in Soviet time probably they reconstructed some of them, like so there was this page with a tiny bit of probably a police report. There were 2 letters on it, and they was carefully kind of stick to the whole page, and I took a picture thinking like, this just looks amazing. That's the state of these archives. They're burned. My fingers were, it's all archives, it's usually dusty, but some of the documents would clearly actually were saved from fire. It looked at this like this, and they all looked like a bunch of just papers burned together. June, July 1908, for example, like Lithuania Bureau reports, June 1906, August 2006. That's that. You don't know much, and you go inside.
I can just imagine.
I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Oh no! I can just imagine like this tiny librarian woman just like saving these police reports. Not
I thought it's just amazing.
Yeah. Someday you're gonna write a book about these, but kind of like piecing together, and there's like an art to it, piecing together all of these tiny bits of reports, sometimes not even complete sentences or complete kind of documents, and pulling all of these queer meanings from them that aren't like almost kind of the things that the state wouldn't find explicitly queer, but you can read into it.
Just to give to this short story to this, when you're reading this, and that's not a part of the book, because it somehow was just so I was reading these reports of, there was a lot of suicide on the street, of course, because, that time, these 2 first decades was a kind of suicide wave in St. Petersburg, as we know from Mark Steinberg. And it was clearly, I could read that, like it's just suicides after suicide, and it was just actually really difficult to read, of course. And one suicide with the man having a red scarf, which is also the symbol of queerness. And I actually burst into tears when I was reading this. Of course, it was a long day, but I just, that was the moment when I was like, probably. I would never know. And that's the point. I would never know. But probably, that man committed suicide because, just a quick story to this. It's archival complexity, I suppose, queer in archives in that regard. So talking about research, future research in Russia. It's difficult. My answer doesn't help, right? But I think it's very difficult for me to sit here in London and to, coming from Cambridge, and to say, but still it's very important to do, just go and uncover the queer histories and do this research about other cities in Russia. But I don't think it's will be right if I say so. It's hard. It's harder than I can explain, I think, and I'm very much aware of my positionality, my privilege here, and I'm really grateful, of course. But I just hope that maybe, and I kind of hope that my book, to some extent, I don't think it will be translated ever, but maybe it will inspire people in Russia not to do the same type of things, but not to go to archives. And I was like, I'll do it, because it's risky. And but maybe, maybe there will be time in the future. I'm not answering this question because I don't have an answer for this question. But I do hope that, it's a history, it has a political meaning. And this political meaning might be indeed in these queer archives and actually finding the parallels between the past in the present in a very painful way, right? And for example, thinking about the propaganda laws, they are vague as this policing, like loitering. What is loitering? How would you define loitering? How would you define soliciting, right? Now, for the purpose of the Bokhari, probably straightforward, but there was just only soliciting or loitering. So, and I think this kind of unclarity creates a lot of risks, of some possibilities to escape, but also a lot of risks. Right.
I mean, sitting in this room thinking about how to define foreign agent and how to define...
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's what I mean.
Yeah, and also I obviously also in a privileged position of already being here and doing my research and kind of having shifted my research in a way that doesn't endanger people who are still in Russia and in a way that lets me not go to Russia is a very privileged thing to be able to do. But also I don't want to talk about this in a way that is just grim and deeply depressing and no one should ever do queer research again.
Yeah, no.
Because first of all, I think people should, and second of all, I think people are. And having these kind of routes of going about it and going to, yeah, kind of trying to find queering the archive and trying to find queer history in places where maybe people don't know it exists, and also maybe the Secret Service agents don't know it could exist there. Do you think the Secret Service agent has read your book? Do you think he's formed a parasocial relationship with you ever since then? And he's been...
Yeah, I still remember his face. I don't know. I don't know whether he'd... No, it will be very interesting. It will be like a film story, right?
Yeah, I can imagine just this like...
It comes to mind this German movie, The Life of Others, when the Secret Service, he was observing the couple and then he actually helps them to escape the German persecution. So, but you know, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think so, to be honest. I hope so, not in a way. You know, my family's still in Russia.
Yeah, but maybe he's been convinced. Maybe you know, the gay propaganda does work, and he's read your book, and now he's a changed person.
If I would be able to convince at least one person, then I think I accomplished my kind of goal of writing this book.
On this note, I think we should turn to questions from the audience. Can we do? Yeah. So I think we have a third mic, and you have to talk into the mic so that people online can hear. And I have many more questions for you, but time.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's not turned on. Thank you very much, Olga, for your presentation, and thank you for writing what looks like and sounds like a very exciting book. And talking about creation of space in the city, and there'll be absolutely partial question. I'm a historian of Russia in the First World War. So, because we know that city of St. Petersburg has lots of military presence, and the guards barracks are everywhere, and they remain in the city even after 1905. And you mentioned Konno-Gvardievsky Boulevard with lots of barracks there. So, and obviously some other research shows that there was lots of kind of homosexual connection in the army as well, and in a way wasn't normalized, or not necessarily normalized, but people were not surprised to learn their officers were sleeping with the sailors at the Navy, in the Navy, for instance. So what role does army play in the creation of the queer milieu in terms of geography of the city, and not also army, but also maybe kind of imperial presence in the city? So why around Tavrichsky, which was Duma seat, but not around, obviously, the Winter Palace? So kind of how that plays in the city. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the question. It's good. So, just thinking how to answer. And first of all, I would say it kind of comes to my mind immediately, and I will probably unfold my answer as I go. You know, actually, it kind of goes beyond the scope, because keep in mind, I'm looking at the public, semi-public spaces and negotiation over the use of them. What you're describing to me seems as if that's the kind of homosexual interactions that happen behind the closed doors, to some extent. Of course, you know, soldiers, they participated in the queer milieu, and I, to some extent, you know, talk a little bit about them, as a being part, Kuzmin mentioned them as they stroll in Tenderness garden. So that's definitely, they're present. But I was actually trying to picture the city that, individuals who are engaged in this milieu, almost trying to go away from the class narrative or any other social states definitions in a way, and I did it on purpose because, first of all, and you need, when you do research, you need to kind of set the boundaries, that's how you do it, and that's what you will focus. And of course, it's a very interesting topic, how actually the military presence transformed the city, and it transformed in many, many ways, not just in terms of queer milieu, I'm pretty sure, just by building the barracks. Actually for my new project on Beastly St. Petersburg, I look at the horses, for example. Well, that's presence of military казарms and their horses transform the whole beastly spaces of the city. So absolutely, that's a very important path to take. I didn't take it. But you're absolutely right. And I think the way they used milieu, my kind of guess will be that they kind of were part of the milieu that existed. It seems to me that they follow the patterns of movements because they did visit bathhouses. They visited the Tavrichsky Garden, the Nevsky Prospect, right? So they were part of this milieu. But to see how they actually transformed, the presence of soldiers, of course, more men come into the city, and we remember that St. Petersburg was a very young city, statistically, it's a young man population. So obviously in that regard, it's just, more men.
Thank you so much for the discussion, and I really liked how you sort of deconstructed the dichotomy between public and private space, because on one hand you have these sort of spaces of hyper-visibility where people would cruise and do other activities, but then at the same time in this public space you're creating these private moments of heat and tenderness as you kind of described. But I was wondering, sort of thinking about the present and the idea of visibility, because you also described how this visibility gave opportunities for surveillance and control, and there's a lot of contemporary discussions about how queer visibility can bring acceptance, but as you've shown, it can also provide risk, especially for those who are the most vulnerable. So I wonder if you could perhaps comment on how these sort of dynamics could potentially play out in the city in contemporary times concerning the debates about visibility and safety. Sorry.
Thinking about contemporary city, I think I would actually refer you to Andrew Tucker's work on queer visibilities in Cape Town. And I also mention him in my book because it's very important theoretical discussion about how we can approach the concept of queer visibility. And visibilities, he uses this term actually in plural because he suggests that it's not, it's very different layers of visibilities. As we can actually think about these dichotomies like for oppression versus visibilities, but actually she suggests it's much more complicated than that. And visibilities comes in different forms, and it comes with different actually self-identification, because he talks about Cape Town, so it's his discussion about, black communities there and different racial communities, minorities. So, and he sees how their different visibilities interact with actual sexual visibilities. So I think that will be probably the best answer for your question, that particular book on queer visibilities. Because in contemporary environments, and contemporary cities, as we know, visibilities come, as I said, in many different forms, right? It's not just, in my book, of course, we talk about, as I said, men were not just men, they also were, husbands, they also were people who work in, just professionals, right? So different layers of identities, and it all brings different layers of visibilities. So that's probably this study of this intersectionality between different identities might be a way to approach that. Does it make sense? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this amazing presentation, and looking forward to reading your book. I have a question also about visibility. I got really interested when you said that we can't measure, for example, the men's makeup by today's values, right? Because it was like a completely different approach to this before, and we should have a kind of a historical approach to these things. But I remember that, for example, Bunin, the writer, wrote about Kuzmin in his diary that he looked like a, I'm sorry, it's a quote, «педераст с полуголым черепом и гробовым лицом, раскрашенным как труп проститутки», which can be translated that he's a homosexual man with a half-bald head and a face painted like a prostitute's corpse. So it is clearly homophobic, right? And it clearly shows that in this case, men's makeup is not something convenient. So I'm wondering, did you find any other signs which kind of, any other materials in your research which kind of draws this line between normal and abnormal, but can like helps us like find this line without measuring it from our point of view?
Yeah.
Like, for example, you said that red scarf was a sign of a homosexual man, right? But maybe any other things. I'm just wondering, did you find this this kind of conventions? Thank you.
So referring to one point, abnormal. I think I will answer this question as a geographer. For example, referring to Kuzmin, he would go into Tarichsky garden with a makeup, with a yellow shirt, because he believes that yellow is the color of homosexuality. Yellow daffodil is a sign, if you look into specific signs, rather red scarf. And, you know, hooligans would not beat him up, right? But on one occasion, he was on the corner of Pushkinskaya Street and Nevsky Prospect, and he was together with friends, and they were kind of, my understanding from reading the diary, that they were kind of obviously visibly queer, and a group of hooligans came and beat them up. So I think then the borders between normality and normality, the answer is actually space. You know, where you perform these specific things. At some place, it will be normal, and it will be acceptable, and nobody will touch you. And even constables, they, as Kuzmin refers it in his diary, like they were teasing constables in Tavrisky garden, and constables would not do anything to them in a particular space. But of course, some spaces would dictate different rules, and they will behave particularly differently, right? So that's kind of normals and abnormals. So that's kind of story that illustrates that point. So again, it's a geographical answer to this. And, you know, did I find any specific, apart from the makeup, as I said, it's yellow daffodil, it's the one thing. Just yellow, I think it's a color, and yellow shirts, you know, that was, I noticed in my writing, in my research. Yeah. And thank you for reading this quote. It's, yeah, but it's Bunin wrote it, so it's kind of.
But he hated everyone.
Yes, yeah, so. Yeah.
Is it time to cancel Bunin? Is this what we're doing now?
No. So, but yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have one question. You mentioned a little bit about it, but I was wondering, is there in the sources any indication of international communication between queer communities? Because, you know, contemporary queer culture is impossible without, you know, these kind of transnational solidarity and, you know, and cross-pollination. So is there any chance, you know, to think in similar terms about that time?
Thank you for this question. Actually, originally when I was imagining this project, I wanted to do a research about London and St. Petersburg and how these two cities were connected in terms of queer milieus. My supervisor discouraged me from doing this. He was right. It would be too much for 3 years. So you have to understand, you know, it's difficult to do a PhD, and to do it on 2 cities, it's completely impossible, I think. But, you know, might be done. So, you know, we know from sources that St. Petersburg was actually regarded as one of the kind of free capitals, so people were traveling to bathhouses and kind of coming to the city. So definitely there was and of course the city has a really big foreigner population who would come and go. So I suppose there definitely were connections between the city. That's why I wanted to do this project, because I thought like international role of the city. It was a capital of one of the largest empire back then. So I could just imagine that probably there were some individuals who would travel between, and there will be men who would travel and they will come to Berlin, between Berlin and Paris, and then to St. Petersburg. So yeah, absolutely, there were connections, but I just didn't explore them in length and in depth in my book. Yeah, but as a position of the city, it clearly should be. And bathhouses were famous for their reputation was not just local and national, but actually international.
I just wanted to. I remember a story, and this is not your historical period, but I just remembered when you asked that question, a story from the recent book on the Soviet queer history, and this basically the story of this English or even Scottish boy, that young man that came to Russia because in 1920s because he heard about how the Soviets basically aren't criminalizing homosexuality, and he was like, this is going to be the queer utopia, and it's communist, I'm gonna have so much fun, I'm gonna have all of this hot sex, and it's gonna be and the revolution is gonna be amazing. And then he came to Russia and turned out that it wasn't actually and he couldn't have all of these this free love and all of this uncriminalized, decriminalized sex. But I can imagine maybe there was, so there were some foreigners back then as well.
Actually, referring to now, again, I'm a slow thinker, I'm sorry. If we think about Wings, Kuzmin's novel, it is about story of relationship between an Englishman and Vanya, right? So it is, in a way, the love between a foreigner and a Russian man. So it's, to some extent, also to answer your question, right?
Thank you. So you kind of describe how this apparatus of surveillance that involved policing, sanitation, health, was sort of used to eliminate these sort of border spaces where the queer milieu would gather. And I was wondering if this has anything to do with the sort of period of time in which it occurred, when there was sort of intensification of capitalist development, modernization, urbanization, and if these two things go hand in hand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for actually bringing some meta-narratives that I do talk about in the book. Obviously, that's the the adverb of leisure culture in the city played an important role, right? Coffee shops, cafe chantants, zoos, circuses, all of that contributed to the formation of this milieu. Rapid urbanization, modernization of the urban environment, the street lighting, all of that. Trams, where they actually, as I suggested in the book, queer men could observe each other, right? So it's really important, of course. It's a kind of a bigger, if you see, if we paint in the map, that will be a background, a very important background. And in coming back to identities, I think the figure of flaneur here is very important. The person who is in a passage, walking and looking at the shops and trying to, pick something, but actually picking not an object from the shop, but actually a friend or a lover, or just a night, right? So that's really important. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it's related to some of the questions that were asked today. So you said that space matters for queer visibility in St. Petersburg, and this seems to be your way of thinking about that. But St. Petersburg was a very large city by that moment, and there was a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the class composition of different neighborhoods. And when we're talking about these queer people were beaten up in this place and not the other one because the ways that they looked, this can be basically boiled down, for example, to the class fault lines that exist in the city. Do you think that this can be done here, or do you argue that there was actual transformation of the kind of like mental map of the city, where like this, in a way, like this district, this neighborhood was yassified, to borrow from the today's language. So like how do you see that?
Do you mean whether this neighborhood, for example, Liteyny Borough, recognized as a queer district of St. Petersburg?
Yes.
Do you mean that?
And like what was the...
Yeah, so I think Liteyny Borough, and I specifically talk about Liteyny Borough in the book, I think it was recognized as such because that particular borough had a lot of bookshops, and they, according to contemporary, like the historical files, we can see that they actually exhibit some pornographic images and novels, and they were not, that was in that particular borough, right, not in others. So in that particular space where we have Tenderness garden, we have two very big commercial bathhouses that were famous for homosexual encounters, right? So yes, I think that was a, to some, it's like a, late St. Petersburg Castro in San Francisco, that's the kind of place. So yes, I think we can call it like this. But also keep in mind that St. Petersburg, yes, it was a big city, but it was, very, very physically dense because the population was concentrated apart, in comparison to other cities, very in the city center. And social stratification was actually up-down. Poor people lived upstairs or downstairs, and in the middle, the rich. So it's kind of a very specific city in that regard too, right? It was very compact in that regard. And also the lack of actually public transportation was really important factor here because people couldn't travel to the factories, so they have to stay relatively close to the place they work. So they would actually find the places within the city with this kind of boundaries of the city center, what we might call it today, right? So yes, you're right, it was a big city, but actually very dense population and living in a very kind of small, compact places, right?
So, I guess...
May I add
yes.
one thing?
Yes, of course.
And my favorite chapter of the book is the last chapter, chapter 5, where I talk about emotional refugees and the city as an emotional refugee. And I think I want to finish my part by saying that, yes, we talk about policing, controlling, oppression, but in that chapter I try to suggest that there is another way of thinking about the queer milieu as a place of emotional refugee, a place where queer men could actually find some happiness, even put it that way, some tenderness and happiness. And Tenderness garden, that was a place where they could find that. And it's also, I think, if we think about the future of doing queer histories, it's very important to keep that in mind. And I think it's, as you said, it's tragic, it's difficult, but, they were also happy in the city, and they loved the city, and the city, the sky in the city proved some kind of love, right? And we shouldn't forget it was also, it is about love, to some extent, right?
I think in my research as well, I kind of try to look at, and I think this is a really great kind of point of referring to the present and thinking about what can we talk about at a time when queer people don't have, their freedoms are being infringed upon, and there is an authoritarian regime, and there are all of these kind of new changes that are affecting queer lives, but we can't forget that there is queer joy and queer lives and tenderness and love, and if we just talk about the repressions and the surveillance and policing, we just forget the stuff that actually makes us human. And
and love can be a very powerful political force, as we know. So let's hope that love somehow help.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Olga. I wanted to mention that we are still open for another half an hour, so if you want to grab a drink, and if Olga has agreed to spend some time with us, we can continue some of these conversations informally. And most importantly, you can buy the book downstairs. Unfortunately, it's quite expensive, but But we managed to sell it cheaper than the publisher or Amazon, so you won't have any better place to buy it than us. And our next event exploring shortlisted books for the Pushkin House Book Prize are happening next week, and we have 2 online events, one with Natasha Lanstrogov discussing Muppets in Moscow. That's a book about the production of Sesame Street in Russia and the way how two societies communicated and learned to understand each other. And then next day we have Ryan's book, Red Leviathan, about Soviet whaling. So basically it's a book about ecological history and how the destruction of species led also to our greater understanding of whales and their habitat. So very nuanced history of Soviet ecological thinking. And then the week after, on Monday, 12th of June, we have an event with Trisha Starks, who reads a lecture about cigarettes and Soviets. So basically, it's a history of healthcare and how it was treated differently in the Soviet Union in comparison to the West, the general West, and how despite lack of advertising and branding, smoking was so popular in the Soviet Union, and actually that challenges our general understanding of healthcare and our approaches to healthcare today. And then we have an event with Mark Giliotti and Ekaterina Shulman. Ekaterina is a chair of the panel of judges of the book prize. That's happening on the 14th of June at Logan Hall, and on the 15th you can come here and learn the winner. So we still sell the tickets to that. They're quite costly, but they include food and drinks, and you will have a chance to meet all the authors, to see Olga, and to meet some of the judges. So please come to some of the events, and I'll be happy to see you again.